The late summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road leading to Crosswind, Nebraska. Thomas Mercer wiped the sweat from his brow as his wagon approached the small settlement. After 3 weeks on the trail from Boston, the sight of buildings on the horizon was a welcome relief. A historian by profession, Thomas had come to document the settlement patterns of the western frontier, but he'd heard whispers of something else that piqued his scholarly curiosity. "He's a fella from back east?" The livery stable owner squinted at Thomas as he handed over the reins of his horse. "Yes, sir. Thomas Mercer from the Historical Society of Massachusetts," the man grunted, giving Thomas a once-over. Not much to see in Crosswind these days. The town's half empty since the railroad went through Hartwick instead." Thomas nodded, retrieving his leather satchel from the wagon. "Particularly interested in local histories. I heard there might be some, unusual stories about this region." The stable owner's face darkened. "You'd be talking about the Blackwood sisters, I reckon. That's ancient history now. 30 years gone." "That's exactly what I'm here to research," Thomas said, his interest heightened by the man's reaction. "Is there somewhere in town I might stay for a few weeks? Widow Caldwell rents rooms at the edge of town. Only place left." The man pointed down the dusty main street. "But listen here, mister. Some stories are best left buried. Especially that one." Thomas thanked him and started down the street, noting the boarded-up storefronts and general air of decay that hung over Crosswind. What had once been a promising frontier settlement was now clearly a town in decline. As he walked, he felt eyes on him from behind curtained windows. Newcomers were rare here now, and clearly cause for suspicion. The widow's boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure badly in need of paint. Martha Caldwell, a stern-faced woman with iron-gray hair, showed him to a small room on the 2nd floor. "Meals at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening," she said flatly. "No exceptions. $2 a week paid in advance." As Thomas settled his belongings, he noticed a faded photograph on the wall, the only decoration in the sparse room. It showed Crosswind in its heyday, perhaps 40 years earlier. A crowd gathered around what appeared to be a small roadside establishment. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called, catching her before she departed. "What's this building here with all the people?" The widow paused in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she studied the photograph. "That would be the Blackwood pie shop," she said quietly, "before all the trouble started." "Trouble?" Martha Caldwell's mouth tightened to a thin line. "If you're here about the Blackwood sisters, Mr. Mercer, you're digging in a grave that's long since been filled. Some things in this town we don't discuss." She turned to leave, then added, "The sheriff keeps the old records, if you're determined to pester someone about it." That evening at dinner, Thomas found himself alone in the small dining room. The beef stew was bland but filling, and he used the solitude to organize his notes. The story that had drawn him to Crosswind was fragmentary at best. Mentions in Eastern newspapers about the notorious Blackwood sisters and their house of horrors on the Nebraska prairie, but details were scarce, and that only intensified his curiosity. After dinner, Thomas decided to walk through the town. The setting sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and distant rain. At the far end of town, beyond the last row of houses, he could make out what appeared to be the remains of a foundation, partially reclaimed by prairie grass. Something about the location stirred his memory of the photograph. As he stood contemplating the ruins, a voice behind him made him start. "You won't find much there except ghosts." Mr. Thomas turned to find an elderly man leaning on a walking stick, regarding him with rheumy eyes. "Were these the Blackwood sisters' place?" Thomas asked. The old man nodded slowly. "Burned it to the ground after they found what was in the cellar. Some say you can still hear the screams if you listen on a quiet night." He tapped his walking stick against the hard-packed earth. 23 travelers, they reckon. Maybe more. All stopped for a slice of pie and a bed for the night. None ever left. The next morning dawned with a heavy mist hanging over Crosswind. Thomas rose early, eager to visit the sheriff's office and begin his research in earnest. The town seemed different in the pale morning light, less threatening, more melancholy, like a place slowly being forgotten by the world. Sheriff Daniel Holt was younger than Thomas expected, perhaps 40, with a weathered face and watchful eyes that suggested he'd seen more than his years might indicate. His office was small but meticulously organized, with wanted posters neatly tacked to one wall and a gun rack behind his desk. "Blackwood sisters?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair after Thomas introduced himself and stated his purpose. "That's a name not many folks around here like to hear. What's your interest in them?" Academic Thomas replied, setting his notebook on the desk. "I'm documenting unusual criminal cases of the frontier for the Historical Society." Sheriff Holt studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in it now. Everyone involved is long dead. He stood and moved to a large cabinet against the far wall. My father was deputy sheriff back then. He kept extensive records, couldn't sleep for months after what they found. The sheriff returned with a dusty box and placed it on the desk between them. These are the official documents, plus my father's personal notes. I've never shown these to anyone outside law enforcement. The box contained several folders of yellowed papers, a leather-bound journal, and a small collection of daguerreotypes wrapped in cloth. Thomas carefully opened the first folder, which contained the official reports. The Blackwood sisters, Eliza and Rose, arrived in Crosswind in 1857, Sheriff Holt explained as Thomas examined the documents. They bought land on the main road when this was still the primary route west, built a small establishment that served food to travelers and offered rooms for the night. Nothing unusual for the time. Thomas nodded, reading through the initial settlement records. The sisters had paid cash for their land, an unusual circumstance that was noted by the record keeper. They were in their late 30s when they arrived, unmarried and kept mostly to themselves except when serving customers. Their pie shop became somewhat famous in the region, the sheriff continued. Travelers would go miles out of their way for a slice of their apple pie. The sisters always seemed to have fresh fruit, even out of season. Thomas turned to a page where the neat handwriting suddenly became more hurried, the ink blotched in places. What changed? He asked, sensing the shift in the narrative. Sheriff Holt's face darkened. In the spring of 1861, a family passing through reported to authorities in Omaha that they'd stopped at Crosswind and encountered something disturbing. They'd intended to stay the night but changed their minds. Said they saw blood seeping through the floorboards while they ate their pie. The sheriff carefully unwrapped one of the daguerreotypes and slid it across the desk. It showed two women in their 40s standing stiffly before their establishment. Though the image was faded, Thomas could make out their severe expressions, their plain dark dresses, and the sign above the door, Blackwood Sisters Pies and Lodging. The Omaha authorities sent word to my father, but when they went to investigate, the sisters explained it away, said they'd been butchering a pig in the cellar. Everything seemed in order, so they left. The sheriff's voice dropped lower, but my father couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He started keeping track of travelers who passed through Crosswind, comparing notes with other settlements down the line. Thomas flipped through the pages, finding a careful ledger of names and dates. He noticed people were disappearing, he murmured, seeing the pattern emerge in the records. Yes, but it took months to be certain. Travelers often changed routes or plans. The frontier was dangerous. Accidents, Indian attacks, illness. People disappeared all the time. But eventually the pattern became clear. Folks who stayed with the Blackwood sisters never reached their next destination. The sheriff opened the leather journal. This was my father's personal account. He couldn't prove anything officially yet, but he began watching the sisters closely. What he observed, well, it'll turn your stomach. The sheriff's father's journal was a disturbing chronicle of mounting suspicion and horror. As Thomas read the increasingly frantic entries from the spring and summer of 1861, a pattern emerged that chilled him despite the warmth of the morning. Deputy James Holt had begun by noting seemingly innocent details, deliveries of unusual quantities of lard and sugar to the Blackwood establishment, the sisters' habit of accepting only travelers who appeared prosperous, their reluctance to allow anyone into their cellar. But as weeks passed, his observations became more sinister. June 4, 1861, Thomas read aloud. Followed E.B. to abandon Wallace's mine. She carried a heavy sack which appeared to contain metal objects. Discovered later that Carson family reported missing silver service after passing through C cannot prove connection. My father became obsessed, Sheriff Holt said quietly. He started tracking every traveler who came through town, noting who stopped at the sisters' place and who was never seen again. Thomas turned the page, finding a crude map with small X's marked at various points around the property. What are these? Fresh graves, he suspected. But he couldn't justify digging up the prairie based on hunches. The sheriff's expression was grim. And then came Jacob Wright. According to the journal, Wright was the butcher from Hartwick, the larger settlement 15 miles east. He made monthly trips to Crosswind to buy and sell goods, often stopping at the Blackwood establishment for their famous pie. July 18, 1861, Thomas read, J.W. came to me in great distress this evening. Claims he recognized a distinctive gold pocket watch chain being worn by R.B. Said it belonged to H. Milbury, a cattle buyer who passed through last month and never arrived in Hartwick. When Wright inquired about it, R.B. became agitated and claimed it was a gift from a cousin. Wright not convinced. The next several entries documented the deputy's efforts to build a case. His frustration with the lack of concrete evidence, and his growing conviction that travelers were being murdered in the Blackwood cellar. August 3, 1861. Thomas continued reading. J.W. offered to help. Will purchase pie tomorrow and attempt to gain access to cellar on pretext of selling meat storage advice. God help him if sister's suspect. The following entry made Thomas's blood run cold. August 4th. J.W. did not return from Blackwood Place. Observed smoke from chimney late in the night despite warm weather. Must act now. Sheriff Holt took up the narrative. My father gathered a group of trusted men from town. They waited until they saw both sisters leave the property the next morning. They always went to church on Sundays, keeping up appearances, and then they forced entry. The journal described what they found in clinical, shocked language. The cellar of the Blackwood establishment had been converted into a butchery, with metal hooks hanging from the ceiling beams, drainage channels cut into the stone floor, and a large cast-iron rendering pot in the corner. But it wasn't animals they had been butchering. They found human bones in the ash pit behind the kitchen, the sheriff said, his voice hollow, and in the cellar, preserved in salt barrels, parts that ... double quotes he trailed off, shaking his head. The rendering pot still contained fat being processed into lard, and in the pantry, rows of pies cooling. Thomas felt his stomach lurch as the implication became clear. They were ... cooking their victims? Sheriff Holt nodded grimly, and serving them to their next guests. My father's theory was that they selected victims with valuables, murdered them in the night, disposed of the bodies by ... processing them, and then robbed whatever wealth they carried. The journal's final entries detailed the discovery of personal effects, watches, jewelry, wallets, even dentures with gold teeth hidden in the sisters' bedroom. Most damning of all was a leather-bound ledger in which the sisters had meticulously recorded their victims, the valuables taken, and chillingly, which cuts had been used for what purpose. When they realized what they'd found, my father sent riders to alert the authorities in Omaha and to intercept the sisters on their way back from church, Sheriff Holt continued. But somehow, the sisters must have been warned. The sisters never returned from church that Sunday. As Thomas read through the records, he learned that what followed was one of the largest manhunts in Nebraska Territory history. The gruesome discoveries at the Blackwood property became front-page news across the country. A sensational tale of murder and cannibalism on the frontier that both horrified and fascinated the public back east. They found the sisters' buggy abandoned about 20 miles south, Sheriff Holt explained, spreading out a faded map on his desk. Right here, near the Kansas border. Tracks suggested they'd met someone with horses. After that, the trail went cold. The next folder contained telegrams from law enforcement offices across multiple states, all responding to inquiries about the Blackwood sisters. Sightings were reported as far away as New Orleans and San Francisco, but none led to captures. My father believed they had help, the sheriff said, pointing to another journal entry. Someone who knew the territory, maybe someone they'd been working with all along. How else could two middle-aged women disappear so completely? Thomas carefully examined a wanted poster that had been circulated throughout the Western Territories. The artist's rendition showed two severe-looking women with thin lips and cold eyes. The reward for their capture was substantial, $500 dead or alive, an enormous sum for the time. The case remained active for nearly 5 years, Sheriff Holt said. Eventually, other crimes took precedence. Memories faded, and the Blackwood sisters became more legend than ongoing investigation. Thomas made careful notes as he continued through the documents. Was there ever any indication of where they came from originally? Before Nebraska? The sheriff nodded. My father looked into that. He found evidence they might have operated a similar establishment in Pennsylvania years earlier under different names. 3 women then, not 2. When authorities there began investigating disappearances, they vanished overnight, just like here. 3 women? Thomas asked, his pen poised above his notebook. Yes. My father believed there was an older sister who died before they came to Nebraska. The sheriff handed him another document. This is a letter from a Pennsylvania sheriff responding to my father's inquiry. Mentions the Morgan sisters, Ruth, Eliza, and Rose, who ran a boarding house outside Pittsburgh. Similar pattern of missing travelers. Thomas felt a chill run through him despite the warming day. So they'd done this before. And may have continued elsewhere, the sheriff added grimly. Though they'd be quite elderly by now, if they're still alive. The final documents in the box detailed what happened to the Blackwood property after the sisters' flight. The building had been burned to the ground by outraged townsfolk, despite the authorities' desire to preserve it for evidence. The land was seized by the county and eventually sold, though no one ever built on it again. The human remains discovered there, too fragmentary and numerous to identify individually, were given a Christian burial in the town cemetery. There's a memorial stone, Sheriff Holt said, closing the box as Thomas finished his notes. Simple marker that says here, lie the unknown victims of evil, 1861. Some travelers still stopped to leave flowers. And the sisters themselves? No trace was ever found? The sheriff hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a final daguerreotype, not included with the others. This came to us in 1870, almost 9 years after they fled. No note, no explanation. Just appeared on my father's desk one morning. The image showed a neatly tended grave with a simple headstone. Though the writing was too small to read clearly, the date visible on the stone was 1868. My father believed it was sent as a message that one sister had died, but the other was still out there somewhere. Sheriff Holt reclaimed the photograph. He was convinced until his dying day that Rose Blackwood was watching Crosswind, perhaps even returned from time to time. Thomas felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Do you believe that? The sheriff carefully returned the photograph to his drawer. Okay. What I believe, Mr. Mercer, is that evil rarely vanishes completely. It just finds a new place to take root after leaving the sheriff's office. Thomas spent the afternoon organizing his notes at a small table in the corner of Crosswind's only remaining saloon. The barkeeper kept his distance, serving Thomas's occasional requests for coffee without engaging in conversation. The few other patrons, weathered farmers and laborers, cast curious glances his way, but seemed equally reluctant to approach. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Thomas found himself troubled by the gaps in the Blackwood sisters' story. How had two women managed such a gruesome enterprise without detection for years? Where had they come from originally? And perhaps most disturbingly, where had they gone after fleeing Nebraska? Lost in thought, he barely noticed when someone slid into the chair across from him until a thin hand reached out to touch his notes. You shouldn't be digging into this, said Martha Caldwell, her voice low and tense. No good comes from stirring up old ghosts. Thomas straightened, surprised to see his landlady in the saloon. Mrs. Caldwell, I didn't expect to see you here. Saw you coming hours ago. Been waiting for you to finish. Her eyes darted around the room. Not here. Come with me. Intrigued, Thomas gathered his notes and followed the widow out into the early evening air. She led him not back to the boarding house, but toward the edge of town in the direction of the old Blackwood property. My mother knew them, Mrs. Caldwell said abruptly as they walked. Traded with them. Said they were always polite, always paid their debts promptly. Hard to reconcile with what they did. Thomas nodded encouragingly. Did you know them yourself? I was just a girl, 12 when it all came out. Martha's face was grim in the fading light. I remember being terrified for weeks after. Couldn't sleep without seeing their faces in my dreams. But that's not why I'm talking to you now. They had reached the remains of the foundation, barely visible now among the prairie grass. Martha stopped, looking out over the empty land. The night they found what was in that cellar, after word spread through town, my father locked our doors and kept his shotgun loaded. Said he'd seen Rose Blackwood watching our house days earlier, like she was taking measure of us. The widow shivered despite the warm evening. When they didn't catch the sisters, that fear never quite left. For years, every stranger was looked at with suspicion. Thomas made a note. The sheriff mentioned a theory that they had help escaping. Martha nodded. That's what most believed. There was a peddler who came through, regular man named Isaiah Hobbs. Disappeared right after the sisters did. Some thought he'd been their victim, but my father was convinced he'd helped them escape. Said he'd seen Hobbs and Eliza in close conversation many times. Do you know if anyone investigated this Hobbs? They tried. Sheriff sent inquiries all over, but it was like he never existed. Martha turned to face Thomas directly. Listen to me, Mr. Mercer. There's something about this case that never sat right with those who lived through it. The sisters were evil, yes, but they weren't stupid. They covered their tracks too well, planned their escape too perfectly. Thomas frowned. What are you suggesting? That maybe they had more help than just one peddler? That maybe ... double quotes. Martha hesitated, lowering her voice further. Maybe not everyone in Crosswind wanted them caught. Before Thomas could press for clarification, Martha abruptly changed direction, walking toward a small rise beyond the foundation ruins. There's something else you should see. She led him to what appeared to be a small family cemetery, enclosed by a rusted iron fence. 3 weathered gravestones stood within the enclosure. The Blackwood family plot, Martha explained. Not the sisters, they were never found, but look at the dates. Thomas peered at the faded inscriptions. The first stone read Hannah Blackwood, 1788 to 1825. The second, Ezekiel Blackwood, 1784 to 1830. And the third, smaller stone, simply Infant Son, 1823. I don't understand, Thomas said, looking up at Martha. These deaths were decades before the sisters came to Crosswind. Exactly. Martha's expression was grim. The sisters weren't newcomers in 1857. They were returning to family land. Their parents homesteaded here in the early days, died when the girls were young. They were raised by relatives back east, but they knew this place. They chose it deliberately. Thomas felt a chill run through him. Why wasn't this in the sheriff's records? Because it wasn't common knowledge until years later when someone connected the names. By then the case was cold. Martha turned away from the graves. I'm telling you this because whatever you're writing, you should know the complete truth. The Blackwood evil had roots here. Deep roots. As they walked back toward town in the gathering dusk, Martha added one final piece to the puzzle. There's an old woman in Hartwick, Clara Jenkins. She'd be nearly 90 now if she's still living. She was Rose Blackwood's childhood friend before the sisters were sent east. If anyone knows where the darkness in them started, it would be her. Thomas departed for Hartwick early the next morning, hiring a horse from the livery stable for the 15-mile journey. The road was well-traveled, the main artery between the two settlements, and Thomas couldn't help but think of the countless travelers who had taken this same route, some of whom had stopped for a fatal night's lodging at the Blackwood establishment. Hartwick proved to be everything Crosswind was not: thriving, bustling, with a proper train station and brick buildings lining its main street. The railroad had clearly brought prosperity here while sentencing Crosswind to a slow decline. Finding Clara Jenkins proved surprisingly easy. She was something of a local institution, the town's oldest resident, who now lived with her granddaughter's family in a neat white house on Hartwick's north side. Mrs. Jenkins doesn't get many visitors these days, her granddaughter Sarah explained as she showed Thomas to the parlor. Her mind wanders sometimes, but she has good days. This seems to be one of them. Clara Jenkins sat by the window, a quilt across her lap despite the warm day. Her face was deeply lined, her white hair thin but neatly arranged, and her eyes, though clouded with cataracts, were alert and watchful as Thomas entered. After introductions and an explanation of his research, Thomas was surprised by the old woman's eager response. "Rose and Eliza Blackwood," she said, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested. "Lord above, I haven't heard those names spoken aloud in years, though I think of them often enough." "I understand you knew them as children," Thomas prompted gently. Clara nodded, her gaze turning toward the window, though Thomas suspected she was seeing not the neat Hartwick street but the Nebraska prairie of 7 decades past. "I knew them before the darkness took them," she said softly. "We were children together. Their homestead was 5 miles from my family's place, isolated, but that was common then. Their mother Hannah was a gentle soul, always sickly. Their father Ezekiel was—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He was a hard man, God-fearing," he said, "but there was cruelty in his faith." Thomas took notes as Clara described the Blackwood family of the 1820s. Ezekiel's strict religious practices, the remote homestead where visitors were unwelcome, and the 3 Blackwood daughters, Ruth the eldest, born in 1815, Eliza, born in 1819, and 1822. The girls were only allowed to socialize at church meetings, Clara continued. "That's where I came to know Rose. She was so hungry for friendship, for any contact outside her family. She would whisper to me about their life at home, the harsh punishments, the long hours of prayer, the strange rituals their father insisted upon." "Rituals?" Thomas inquired. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. Ezekiel believed in purging sin through suffering. He would deny them food for days, make them kneel on dried corn kernels until their knees bled, lock them in the root cellar to contemplate their wickedness. Rose said he was obsessed with the idea that evil lived inside them, inside all women since Eve's original sin. The picture that emerged was disturbing, a remote homestead ruled by a religious zealot. 3 young girls essentially prisoners, and a mother too weak or too afraid to intervene. "Everything changed when Hannah had another baby, a son, finally after 3 daughters," Clara continued. "Ezekiel was ecstatic, but the infant was sickly from birth, and within a month, he died. Hannah never recovered, physically or mentally. She passed away 2 years later." "And the girls remained alone with their father?" Thomas asked. Clara nodded. "For a time. Rose stopped coming to church. Didn't see her for almost a year. Then one Sunday, only Ruth appeared. She was 16 by then. When asked about her family, she said her father was ill and her sisters were caring for him." Clara's voice dropped lower. 2 weeks later, word came that Ezekiel Blackwood had died, a fall from the barn loft, Ruth said. There was no doctor to examine him, no questions asked. Death was common then, especially among men working alone. Thomas felt a chill despite the warm room. "You suspected something else?" The old woman's eyes met his directly. "I saw Rose again, months later. She had changed." There was a coldness in her, a distance. She told me that, double quotes. Clara hesitated. She told me that her father had finally freed them from sin, that they had helped him ascend. Those were her words. You believe they killed him, Thomas said quietly. I believe he broke something in those girls that could never be repaired, Clara replied. After Ezekiel's death, the sisters stayed on the homestead for another year, but they were different, secretive, self-sufficient. Then Ruth announced they were going east to live with their mother's family. The property was sold. Everyone thought that was the end of the Blackwood story here, until Eliza and Rose returned in 1857, Thomas said. Clara nodded. By then, I was married with children of my own, living here in Hartwick. I heard about two sisters starting a pie shop in Crosswind, but I never connected them to the Blackwood girls I'd known. They had changed their appearance, and who would expect those children to return after all those years? She shook her head sadly. I should have known. Perhaps I could have prevented what happened. What about Ruth? Thomas asked. The oldest sister wasn't with them when they returned. Clara's face darkened. No, and I've often wondered about that. From what I've pieced together from news accounts over the years, I believe Ruth may have been the older sister who reportedly died in Pennsylvania before Eliza and Rose came west again. Or perhaps they killed her too, Thomas suggested grimly. Perhaps, Clara conceded. Or perhaps she escaped them. I prefer to think that at least one of those damaged children found a different path. She sighed heavily. You have to understand, Mr. Mercer, those girls were victims before they were monsters. What was done to them doesn't excuse what they became. But it helps explain it. As Thomas prepared to leave, Clara grasped his arm with surprising strength. There's one more thing, something I've told no one else. Her voice had dropped to a whisper. 10 years ago I received a letter. No return address, but the postmark was from Arizona Territory. Inside was just a pressed flower and 3 words, Remember me kindly. Thomas felt the hair rise on his arms. You believe it was from one of the sisters? Clara nodded slowly. Rose always loved wildflowers. Would pick them even when her father forbade such frivolous activities. Her clouded eyes seemed to look through Thomas. I burned the letter, but I've always wondered, was it a farewell or a warning? The journey back to Crosswind gave Thomas ample time to consider Clara Jenkins' revelations. The Blackwood sisters' story had become more complex, more tragic, yet no less horrifying. As the horse carried him along the dusty road, he found himself looking at each isolated homestead they passed with new eyes, wondering what secrets might lie behind their weathered doors. He arrived in Crosswind as evening approached, returning the horse to the livery stable before heading to the sheriff's office. Daniel Holt was still there, reviewing wanted posters by lamplight. Oh, Mr. Mercer, the sheriff greeted him. Find anything useful in Hartwick? Thomas shared Clara Jenkins' account of the Blackwood family's early years, watching the sheriff's expression grow increasingly troubled. So the sisters returned to their childhood home deliberately, Holt mused when Thomas finished. Came full circle to continue their killing where it all began. It appears so, Thomas agreed. Though Clara's letter suggests at least one of them may have survived well into the 1880s. Possibly in Arizona, the sheriff nodded thoughtfully. That tracks with some rumors my father collected over the years. There were unconfirmed reports of similar disappearances near Tucson in the 1870s, travelers who stopped at a remote boarding house run by an elderly woman, never to be seen again. Was there any investigation? Territory was still pretty wild then. By the time authorities connected the pattern, the boarding house was abandoned. Holt shrugged. Could have been the Blackwoods, could have been coincidence. Frontier justice was unpredictable. Plenty of people met bad ends without official notice. Thomas made a note to research Arizona newspaper archives when he returned east. There's one aspect of the case I'm still struggling with, he said. How did the sisters manage to dispose of so many bodies without raising suspicion? Even with their processing methods, there would have been remains. The sheriff's expression darkened. According to my father's notes, they were methodical. Bones were either burned to ash in their large hearth or ground to meal and scattered on their garden. Nothing wasted. He hesitated, then added, there was also evidence they kept pigs, efficient disposers of almost anything organic. Thomas felt his stomach turn at the clinical description, and no one noticed travelers going in but not coming out. Crosswind was busier then, with folks passing through daily. The sisters were clever. They targeted people traveling alone or in pairs. Never families with children, and always those who seemed to be carrying valuables. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. They also spread stories about additional roads and shortcuts their guests had taken, to explain why someone might not be seen leaving by the main road. The conversation was interrupted by a young deputy bursting through the door. Sheriff, there's been a break-in at the records office. Both men were on their feet instantly. When? Holt demanded, reaching for his gun belt. Just discovered it now. Jane Simmons went to file the weekly report and found the place ransacked. The three men hurried down the street to the small municipal building that housed Crosswind's official records. The front door stood open, its lock broken. Inside, file drawers had been pulled out and papers scattered across the floor. Anything obviously missing? The sheriff asked as they surveyed the damage. Jane Simmons, the town clerk, shook her head. Hard to tell with this mess, but it doesn't look like they took the tax records or land deeds. The Blackwood files, Thomas said suddenly. Are they kept here as well? The clerk looked confused, but Sheriff Holt immediately crossed to a cabinet in the corner. He yanked open a drawer and rifled through it, his expression growing grim. Gone, he confirmed. The official record book of the Blackwood case. It contained everything: witness statements, inventory of items found in their house, the list of suspected victims. Could it be coincidence? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. The sheriff fixed him with a hard stare. You come to town asking questions about a case 30 years cold and suddenly those records disappear? No, Mr. Mercer. Someone doesn't want you learning more about the Blackwood sisters. As they left the records office, Thomas noticed the setting sun casting long shadows down Crosswind's Main Street. For the first time since his arrival, he felt a distinct sense of being watched. Perhaps I should continue my research elsewhere, he suggested. I've troubled your town enough. Sheriff Holt shook his head. Whoever did this is already spooked. If you leave suddenly, they might decide to eliminate any risk you pose. It's better to stay where I can keep an eye on things. He placed a hand on his holstered revolver. Besides, I'd like to know who in my town is still protecting the Blackwood sisters' secrets after all these years. That night, Thomas found sleep elusive. His room at the widow's boarding house seemed stuffier than before, the walls closer. From his window, he could see the distant outline of the old Blackwood property in the moonlight. Was it his imagination, or was there a figure standing at the edge of the foundation ruins? He blinked, and the apparition was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Thomas awoke to the sound of rain pattering against his window. The storm that had threatened for days had finally arrived, turning Crosswind's dusty streets to mud and casting a gray pall over the settlement. After a quiet breakfast, during which Martha Caldwell seemed even more taciturn than usual, Thomas decided to visit the telegraph office to send a message to his colleagues in Boston. The telegrapher, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, greeted Thomas with unusual warmth, the first friendly face he'd encountered in Crosswind. You must be the historian, the man said, extending his hand. Walter Green. I run the telegraph and the post office, such as it is these days. Thomas shook the offered hand. Thomas Mercer. I'd like to send a telegram to Boston if possible. Certainly, certainly. Though I should tell you there's already one waiting for you. Green reached beneath his counter and produced a yellow slip of paper. Came in last night, but it was too late to deliver it. Surprised, Thomas accepted the telegram. It was from his assistant at the Historical Society, researched Blackwood sisters. As requested, Stop found earlier newspaper accounts from Philadelphia 1840s. Stop 3 sisters ran boarding house there. Stop 12. Guests disappeared over 2 years. Stop sisters fled before arrest. Stop sending full documentation by post. Stop exercise caution. Stop troubling news? Green asked, noting Thomas's expression. Just confirmation of some research, Thomas replied, folding the telegram carefully and tucking it into his pocket. I'd like to send a reply if I may. As Thomas composed his response, requesting additional information about any Arizona connections, he felt Green watching him with unusual intensity. You know, the telegrapher said casually as he prepared to send the message, my father was the telegrapher here during the Blackwood incident. Sent out the alerts to neighboring towns when they discovered what had happened. Thomas looked up with interest. He must have known details that never made it into the official reports. Green nodded, his fingers pausing over the telegraph key. He said the sisters received regular telegrams from someone signing only as R, brief messages, always in code. The sheriff at the time suspected they were communications from accomplices, but they never cracked the meaning. R could be Ruth, Thomas mused aloud. The oldest sister. Green's eyebrows rose. You know about her? Most accounts only mention the 2. I've been doing thorough research, Thomas replied carefully, suddenly wary of revealing too much. Were any of those coded telegrams preserved? Not that I know of. But ... double. Quotes. Green hesitated, glancing toward the door to ensure they were alone. My father kept a personal logbook where he recorded unusual transmissions. Family tradition, I suppose. I've continued it myself. The telegrapher reached beneath his desk again and withdrew a worn leather journal. After you asked about the Blackwood case yesterday, I got curious and looked through my father's old records. Found something interesting. He opened the journal to a marked page. This was received 2 days before the sisters disappeared. Addressed to Eliza Blackwood. Thomas read the brief notation. Foundations compromised. Stop. Return to the source. Stop. RA warning. Thomas said, his pulse quickening. Someone tipped them off about the investigation. Green nodded. My father always believed they had an accomplice in town. Someone who alerted them when suspicions arose. Any theories about who? The telegrapher shrugged. Could have been anyone. The sisters were polite to everyone, paid their bills on time, donated generously to the church. They were well regarded. Until they weren't. As Thomas left the telegraph office, the rain had intensified, forcing him to dash through puddles to the sheriff's office. He found Daniel Holt at his desk, cleaning his revolver with methodical care. Sheriff, Thomas said, shaking water from his coat. I've received some information you should know about. He shared the contents of both telegrams and what Walter Green had told him about the coded messages. The sheriff listened intently, his expression darkening. So they had a network, he said when Thomas finished. Not just 2 isolated killers, but a coordinated group, possibly including the oldest sister, who warned them when to flee and where to go next. It would explain how they operated so long without capture, Thomas agreed. Now they disappeared so effectively. The sheriff reassembled his revolver with practiced movements. Doesn't explain who stole those records, though. After 30 years, who in Crosswind would still be protecting their secrets? Before Thomas could respond, the door burst open, admitting a drenched deputy. Sheriff, you better come quick. There's been a fire at the widow's boarding house. Thomas felt his blood run cold. My notes, he began, but the sheriff was already on his feet. Let's go, Holt said grimly, holstering his weapon. They raced through the downpour to find Martha Caldwell's boarding house engulfed in smoke, though the heavy rain had prevented the flames from spreading beyond one section of the building. A small crowd had gathered despite the weather, passing buckets of water in a line from the town well. Anyone hurt? The sheriff demanded of a soot-streaked man coordinating the bucket brigade. Don't think so. Widow Caldwell was at the Mercantile when it started. No other boarders this week except him. The man nodded toward Thomas. Where did it start? Thomas asked, dreading the answer. Second floor, east side, the man replied. Your room, mister. As the last flames were extinguished, Sheriff Holt and Thomas were able to enter the damaged building. The staircase was still intact, though treacherous with water and debris. Thomas's room was devastated, the bed reduced to charred springs, the desk where he'd left his notes now a pile of ashes. This was deliberate, the sheriff said, examining the remains of an oil lamp that had crashed to the floor. Someone didn't want your research leaving Crosswind. Thomas knelt among the ashes, searching futilely for anything that might have survived. All my notes, the copies of documents I made, ... double quotes. Not a coincidence, Sheriff Holt said firmly. First the official records, now your research. Someone's desperate to bury this story again. As they descended the stairs, they found Martha Caldwell in the entrance hall, her face pale with shock as she surveyed the damage to her property. Mrs. Caldwell, the sheriff approached her. Did you see anyone near the boarding house before the fire? The widow shook her head, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. I was at Pearson's store for nearly an hour. Could have been anyone. Her eyes found Thomas. I warned you, Mr. Mercer, some secrets fight to stay buried. This goes beyond secrets, Thomas replied, anger rising through his shock. This is about protecting someone or something, even after all these years. As they stepped back outside, the rain had slackened to a drizzle. The crowd had mostly dispersed, returning to their daily routines now that the excitement was over. Thomas noticed Walter Green among those lingering, watching the damaged boarding house with an expression Thomas couldn't quite decipher. You need a safe place to stay, Sheriff Holt said, following Thomas's gaze. And I need to find out who's behind this before anyone gets hurt. Or worse, I might have lost my notes, Thomas said grimly, but I haven't lost what I've learned. The Blackwood sisters were part of something larger, a family enterprise that spanned decades in multiple states, and someone in Crosswind is still connected to it. The sheriff nodded, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. Tonight you'll stay at my house. Tomorrow we start asking harder questions. Sheriff Holt's home was modest but comfortable, located just behind the jail for convenience. His wife, Sarah, a quiet woman with kind eyes, prepared a simple dinner while Thomas and the sheriff reviewed what they knew, trying to reconstruct Thomas's lost notes from memory. The pattern is clear, Thomas said, drawing a rough timeline on a sheet of paper. The Blackwood sisters, or some combination of them, operated in at least 3 locations that we know of: Philadelphia in the 1840s, here in Nebraska in the late 1850s and early 1860s, and possibly Arizona in the 1870s. Always the same method, the sheriff added. Establish a respectable business serving travelers, identify victims carrying valuables, murder them, dispose of the bodies, and collect their possessions. And always with a warning system in place, Thomas continued. Someone to alert them when suspicions arose, allowing them to escape before capture. Sarah Holt, who had been quietly serving stew, spoke up unexpectedly. My grandmother used to say evil travels in threes. Both men looked up at her. What do you mean? Thomas asked. She shrugged slightly. Just something she would say. That true evil is never solitary. It needs conspirators. She hesitated, then added, if these sisters were as clever as you say, they wouldn't leave loose ends. Anyone who helped them would be bound to them somehow, by blood, by guilt, or by profit. Thomas considered this. The oldest sister, Ruth, she seems to have been the coordinator, sending warnings and possibly arranging new locations after each escape. And locals, the sheriff added thoughtfully. They would need someone in each town who could alert them to suspicions, and help with disposal, maybe even identify promising victims. A troubling thought occurred to Thomas. What if they didn't just move on from place to place? What if they established multiple operations simultaneously? Sheriff Holt leaned forward. Go on. Claire Jenkins mentioned that after the sisters went east following their father's death, they lived with their mother's family. What if that family was actually a network? Other groups doing the same thing in different locations? Thomas's mind was racing now. The Blackwood sisters we know about might be just one branch of something much larger. The sheriff's expression darkened. That's a disturbing thought, Mr. Mercer. But it would explain the coded telegrams, the coordinated escapes, the way they seemed to vanish and reappear elsewhere so effectively. That night, Thomas slept fitfully on the Holt's spare bed, his dreams haunted by images of Ruth, Eliza, and Rose Blackwood standing over him with kitchen knives and gentle smiles. He awoke before dawn, a thought nagging at him from the edges of his consciousness. The foundations, he murmured to himself in the gray pre-dawn light. Return to the source. By the time Sheriff Holt emerged for breakfast, Thomas was fully dressed and impatient. Sheriff, that telegram warning the sisters, it mentioned foundations and returning to the source. I think it might have been literal, not just a coded warning. The sheriff frowned over his coffee. How so? Blackwood family homestead, their parents' original property. Martha Caldwell showed me their family graves, but we never looked for the foundation of their original home. Understanding dawned in the sheriff's eyes. You think there might be something there? After 70 years? Worth checking, Thomas insisted. Clara Jenkins said Ezekiel Blackwood kept his daughters in the root cellar as punishment. What if there's still something there, records, valuables they couldn't carry when they fled? An hour later, they were riding toward the old Blackwood property, accompanied by the deputy. Martha Caldwell had provided approximate directions to the original homestead site, about a mile beyond the family cemetery, near a stand of cottonwood trees that had been used as a landmark by early settlers. The morning was clear after yesterday's rain, the prairie grass glistening with moisture. They located the cemetery first, then continued on until they spotted the cottonwoods in the distance. There, the sheriff pointed to a subtle rise in the land where the grass grew differently. That's likely where the house stood. As they approached, the remains of a foundation became visible, stones arranged in a rough rectangle, mostly reclaimed by prairie vegetation but still discernible. Unlike the later Blackwood property in town, this one had been completely abandoned with no subsequent construction to disturb what might lie beneath. Let's see what we can find, Sheriff Holt said, dismounting and tethering his horse to a stunted tree. The three men began a methodical search of the area, looking for any sign of a cellar entrance or underground structure. After nearly an hour of finding nothing but scattered stones and the occasional rusted farm implement, Thomas was beginning to doubt his theory. Then the deputy called out from the far side of the foundation, Sheriff, think I found something. They gathered around what appeared to be a depression in the ground, partially hidden by a tangle of wild rose bushes. The sheriff used his boot to clear away some of the vegetation, revealing the rotted remains of wooden doors set at an angle into the ground. Root cellar, he confirmed, drawing his revolver. Be careful. No telling what's down there after all this time, or who. It took their combined effort to clear enough debris to pull open the decayed doors. The opening revealed a set of earthen steps descending into darkness. The sheriff produced a lantern from his saddlebag, lit it, and led the way down, with Thomas following and the deputy remaining above to watch the horses. The cellar was surprisingly large and solidly constructed, with stone walls and a packed earth floor. The air was stale but dry, preserved by the relative isolation of the space. The lantern's light revealed shelves built into the walls, most empty but some still holding ancient preserved goods in dusty jars. Looks like a standard root cellar, the sheriff commented, raising the lantern higher to illuminate the corners. Wait, Thomas said, noticing something unusual about the back wall. That section looks different. See how the stones don't quite match the pattern? Sheriff Holt approached the wall, examining it closely. You're right. This section was rebuilt. He pressed against the stones, and to their surprise, a section of the wall pivoted inward with a groan of protesting metal. A hidden room, Thomas whispered as the lantern light spilled into the newly revealed space. The chamber beyond was small but significant. A wooden chest stood against one wall, and a small table held what appeared to be a leather-bound book. But what drew their immediate attention were the walls themselves, covered with names scratched into the stone. Hundreds of them, arranged in neat columns with dates beside them. My God, the sheriff breathed, raising the lantern to illuminate the Macabre record. It's a ledger. In stone. Thomas approached the wall, running his fingers over the scratched names. These go back to the 1820s. This must be where it all started, where Ezekiel Blackwood began the killing. The sheriff was examining the names on another section of wall. These continued through the 1830s and 1840s, after Ezekiel was supposedly dead. The daughters continued his work. Or they killed him and took over, Thomas suggested grimly. Clara Jenkins said Rose told her their father had ascended and freed them from sin. What if his religious mania transformed into something else in his daughter's hands? The sheriff had moved to the table, carefully opening the leather book found there. It's a journal, he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Signed by Ruth Blackwood. He read a few lines and looked up, his face pale in the lantern light. It details their methods, how to select victims, how to process them, how to establish new operations in new locations. It's a manual. Thomas joined him, looking over his shoulder at the neat handwriting that detailed generations of systematic murder with cold precision. The final pages contained what appeared to be a list of locations and names, some crossed out, others still active as of the journal's last entry in 1875. This is bigger than we imagined, Thomas said, his voice hollow in the underground chamber. The Blackwood sisters were just one branch of something that spread across the country. The sheriff carefully wrapped the journal in his handkerchief. This needs to get to federal authorities. If any of these operations are still active. They searched the wooden chest next, finding it filled with personal effects that must have belonged to victims. Watches, jewelry, wallets, even dentures with gold teeth, just as had been found in the sisters' establishment in town. But there was something else beneath these grim trophies. A stack of daguerreotypes, each showing 3 young women in different settings and time periods, but always with the same cold expressions. The sisters, Thomas murmured, examining the images, documenting their work across decades. The final daguerreotype, dated 1873, showed only one sister, elderly but unmistakably Rose Blackwood, standing before a small house in what appeared to be a desert landscape. Scrawled on the back were the words, "The final chapter." As they emerged from the cellar into the bright Nebraska sunlight, Thomas felt as if he were returning from another world, a dark parallel to the American frontier story he had studied his whole career. The deputies, seeing their grim expressions, wisely asked no questions as they secured their discoveries in saddlebags. "We need to return to town immediately," Sheriff Holt said, mounting his horse. "I want these findings documented before anything else happens to the evidence." Thomas nodded, casting one last glance at the innocuous-looking cellar doors, now closed again on their terrible secrets. After all these years, the truth finally emerges. "Not all of it," the sheriff replied grimly. "We still don't know who in Crosswind has been protecting these secrets, who stole the records and burned your notes." As they rode back toward town, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from somewhere on the vast, empty prairie. The ride back to Crosswind was tense with anticipation. Sheriff Holt kept one hand near his holster, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting an ambush. Thomas clutched the saddlebag containing Ruth Blackwood's journal, aware of its significance both historically and as evidence of a horror that might still be ongoing somewhere in America. The town appeared peaceful in the mid-morning sun, its few remaining businesses open, a handful of residents going about their daily routines. Yet Thomas now saw Crosswind differently, not just as a dying frontier settlement, but as a place built on secrets and complicity. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, where Holt immediately began documenting their discoveries, writing detailed descriptions of the hidden cellar, the stone ledger of names, and the contents of the wooden chest. "I'll telegraph the federal marshals in Omaha," he said as he worked. "This goes beyond local jurisdiction now." Thomas was carefully examining the daguerreotypes they'd recovered, looking for any clues to the locations where the sisters had operated. The desert image particularly intrigued him. If Rose had indeed been alive as recently as the 1870s in Arizona territory, there might still be witnesses or records. The door to the sheriff's office opened, admitting Walter Green, the telegrapher. "Sheriff, I received an urgent response to Mr. Mercer's telegram," he said, holding out a yellow slip of paper. His eyes widened at the sight of the materials spread across the desk. "What's all this?" "Evidence," Sheriff Holt said simply, accepting the telegram and handing it to Thomas. "Thank you, Walter." Thomas read the message with growing excitement. Archives reveal Blackwood's sister Ruth died. Philadelphia 1853 stop. Aliso died. Tucson 1879 stop. Newspaper accounts indicate Rose Blackwood still alive. 1888. Operating boarding house near Denver stop. Suspected of at least 15 disappearances. Stop. Authorities never connected to earlier cases. Stop. More information follows by post stop. So we were right, Thomas said, looking up at the sheriff. The operation continued well after Nebraska. Rose was still active decades later and might have trained others to continue after her, Holt added grimly. Walter Green had lingered, his curiosity evident. "You found new information about the Blackwood case?" he asked. "Yes," Thomas replied carefully, still unsure who in town might be connected to the sisters. "It appears their activities were more extensive than previously known." Green nodded thoughtfully. "My father always said there was more to that story than came out publicly." He hesitated, then added, "If you need to send more telegrams, I'll be at my office until 6. After the telegrapher left, Sheriff Holt gave Thomas a warning look. "We keep this between us until I've contacted the federal authorities. I don't trust anyone in this town right now." The rest of the day was spent organizing their evidence and preparing a comprehensive report. The sheriff sent his deputy to Hartwick with an urgent message for the federal marshals, bypassing the local telegraph office as a precaution. As evening approached, Sheriff Holt locked the evidence in his desk. "You'll stay at my house again tonight," he told Thomas. "Tomorrow, once federal authorities have been notified, we can begin questioning townsfolk about any connections to the Blackwood family." They stepped out into the fading daylight to find Martha Caldwell waiting outside the office, her thin face set in determined lines. "Mrs. Caldwell," the sheriff acknowledged her. "What can I do for you?" "It's what I can do for you," she replied cryptically. "You've been to the old homestead." Thomas and the sheriff exchanged glances. "How did you know that?" Holt asked carefully. "This is a small town, Sheriff. People notice things." Martha's gaze shifted to Thomas. "Mr. Mercer, I told you that digging into this history was dangerous. Now I need to show you why." Despite the sheriff's evident suspicion, Thomas found himself intrigued. "Show us what, exactly?" "Not here," Martha said, glancing around the nearly empty street. "At my house. There's something you need to see, something I should have shown you when you first arrived." Sheriff Holt clearly hesitated, but Thomas nodded. "We'll come. Lead the way." The widow's boarding house had been partially repaired after the fire, though Thomas's former room remained uninhabitable. Martha led them not upstairs but to a small parlor at the rear of the house, a room Thomas hadn't entered before. "My mother knew the Blackwood sisters," Martha said as she closed the door behind them, "not just as neighbors. She was connected to them by something stronger than friendship." "What do you mean?" Sheriff Holt asked, his hand drifting near his holstered weapon. Martha moved to a writing desk in the corner and removed a key from around her neck. "Before you judge, understand that some secrets are kept not to protect the guilty, but to protect the innocent." She unlocked a drawer and withdrew a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. "These were my mother's. I found them after she died." Thomas accepted the bundle, carefully untying the ribbon. The letters, yellowed with age, were addressed to dearest Hannah and signed simply R. "Ruth Blackwood," Thomas murmured, looking up at Martha in surprise. "Your mother corresponded with her? I thought Ruth died in Philadelphia." "That was the official story," Martha replied. "In truth, Ruth broke away from her sisters in the 1840s. She was trying to stop what they were doing, what their father had started and taught them to continue." Thomas began reading the letters, his historian's mind quickly piecing together the narrative they contained. Ruth Blackwood had indeed participated in her sister's grim activities initially, but had grown increasingly troubled by their actions. In Philadelphia, she had attempted to leave, only to be threatened by Eliza and Rose. She fled west, Martha continued as Thomas read, changed her name, tried to start a new life. But she couldn't escape the guilt of what she'd done. When she learned her sisters had returned to Nebraska, to their childhood home, she felt responsible. She began warning potential victims away, sending anonymous tips to authorities. "Your mother was helping her," Sheriff Holt said, reading over Thomas's shoulder. "These letters mention coded warnings, information about travelers carrying valuables." Martha nodded. "My mother met Ruth, now calling herself Rebecca, in Omaha. They became friends. When Ruth confided her terrible past, my mother agreed to help prevent further killings. but they were too late to save many victims, Thomas noted, reading further in the correspondence. The sisters had already established their operation here. They tried, Martha insisted. Rebecca knew her sister's methods, helped identify likely targets before they reached Crosswind. My mother would find reasons to warn travelers away from the Blackwood establishment. The final letter in the bundle, dated just days before the discovery of the sisters' crimes, contained a chilling prediction. They suspect me, Hannah. I fear they know I've betrayed them. If anything happens to me, burn this letter and tell no one what we've done. They will never forgive, and Rose will never stop. Ruth was the one who tipped off the authorities, Thomas realized, and her sisters discovered her betrayal. Martha nodded. My mother believed Rose killed Ruth before fleeing Nebraska. The warning telegram you found. Return to the source. That wasn't meant for Eliza and Rose. It was meant for their victims buried at the original homestead. Rose was telling Eliza they needed to eliminate Ruth and then disappear. Sheriff Holt's expression had grown increasingly troubled. Mrs. Caldwell, why didn't your mother come forward with this information after the sisters fled? Fear, Martha said simply. Fear of Rose Blackwood. My mother believed Rose would return one day for vengeance against anyone who had betrayed the family. She lived in terror for years, jumping at shadows, keeping these letters hidden as both evidence and protection. Protection? Thomas inquired. Insurance, Martha explained. If anything happened to her, the letters would prove Rose's guilt. But nothing did happen, at least nothing that couldn't be explained by natural causes. The implication hung in the air between them. Had Rose Blackwood returned to Crosswind at some point, exacting quiet revenge on those who had exposed her? There's something else, Martha said after a moment. Something I've never told anyone. She crossed to a small cabinet and removed a framed photograph, handing it to Thomas. This was taken in Denver in 1889. A friend sent it to my mother. The photograph showed an elderly woman seated before a small boarding house. Though aged significantly, the face was unmistakably Rose Blackwood's, but it was the young woman standing beside her that drew Thomas's attention, a girl of perhaps 16, with the same cold eyes and thin smile that characterized the Blackwood sisters in their youth. She had a daughter, Thomas whispered, feeling a chill run through him. Or a granddaughter. She was training her replacement. The cycle continues, Martha said solemnly. That's why I was reluctant to help your research, Mr. Mercer, not to protect the guilty, but because I fear what might still be out there, who might still be carrying on the Blackwood legacy. Sheriff Holt took the photograph, studying it intently. This changes everything. If Rose established a new generation, T looked up at Martha. Who stole the records from the town office? Who started the fire in Mr. Mercer's room? Martha shook her head. I don't know. There were always rumors that the sisters had helpers in town, people who identified wealthy travelers for them, helped dispose of evidence. Perhaps descendants of those accomplices are still here, still loyal to the family for reasons of their own. As they left the widow's boarding house, the night had fully descended on Crosswind. Few street lamps cast pools of yellow light at intervals along the main street, leaving much in shadow. Thomas felt the weight of the knowledge they had accumulated, not just historical facts for his research, but evidence of an evil that had threaded its way through the American frontier for generations, claiming countless victims. We bring all of this to the federal authorities, Sheriff Holt said as they walked toward his home. Let them track down any remaining connections to the Blackwood family. Thomas nodded, though his historian's mind was already cataloging the work that lay ahead. Archives to search, testimonies to collect, patterns to trace across decades and thousands of miles. The Blackwood sisters' story was far larger than he had imagined when he first arrived in Crosswind. As they passed the telegraph office, Thomas noticed a light still burning inside, though it was well past 6 o'clock when Walter had said he'd close. Through the window he caught a glimpse of the telegrapher bent over his desk, writing urgently. Something about the scene triggered Thomas's memory, the coded telegrams, the warnings that had always reached the sisters in time. Walter had mentioned his father was the telegrapher during the Blackwood incident, had access to all communications, Sheriff Thomas began, but the rest of his words were cut off by the crack of a gunshot. Sheriff Holt staggered, clutching his side. Thomas caught him as he fell, looking up to see Walter Green standing in the doorway of the telegraph office, a smoking revolver in his hand. You shouldn't have come to Crosswind, Mr. Mercer, the telegrapher said calmly. Some family legacies aren't meant to be exposed. As darkness claimed the street and the sheriff's blood seeped between Thomas's fingers, he realized the final chapter of the Blackwood sisters' sinister history had yet to be written.